The world had dissolved into a symphony of thunder and fire, each percussive blast a hammer blow against the fragile shell of reality. Mud, churned to a bloody slurry by countless boots, sucked at my feet with every desperate step. The air was thick with the acrid tang of promethium and ozone, a choking miasma that seared the lungs and stung the eyes. To my left, a flash of searing light, and then nothing where Corporal Vex had stood a moment before, his existence erased in a silent, expanding bloom of heat. To my right, the staccato bark of Lasfire was abruptly cut short, replaced by a wet, tearing sound and a scream that seemed to go on forever, thinning into a gurgle. We were the 114th Cadian, though the name felt like a relic from another life, a prayer whispered into a hurricane. Our lines were not lines anymore, but scattered knots of men and women firing into a shifting, screaming tide of heretics. They came on, a seething mass of corrupted humanity and things that were once human, their forms twisted into blasphemous parodies, their chants a discordant roar that clawed at the mind. A concussive wave threw me forward, the world tilting on its axis. My helmet cracked against something hard, and for a moment there was only ringing silence and the copper taste of blood in my mouth. I pushed myself up, my lasgun slick with grime, its power cell blinking a frantic red. Shapes moved in the smoke, hulking and misshapen. I fired, the beam a weak, sputtering lance into the gloom. It struck a figure clad in tattered robes and rusted iron, who did not fall but turned, its face a ruin of weeping sores and a single, milky eye that held a galaxy of malice. It lumbered towards me, and I fired again, and again until the weapon clicked empty. Hands, cold and unnaturally strong, seized me from behind. I thrashed, my combat knife finding purchase in something that yielded with a wet pop, but more hands grabbed my arms, my legs, my head. I was lifted, my armor seeming as flimsy as paper. I saw the battlefield from this new, helpless angle, a charnel landscape of craters and corpses. I saw Sergeant Kale, his back against a shattered chimera, firing his bolt pistol until a hulking brute with limbs of molten brass tore him in two. I saw the banner of the 114th, the proud Aquila, trampled into the muck by clawed feet. This was not a retreat. This was an ending. They dragged me away from the fading sounds of battle, into the deeper shadows where the smoke coiled like living things. My captors were grotesques, their flesh bulging with unnatural musculature, their faces masked by horned helms or fused into permanent snarls. They did not speak, only grunted and hissed, their breath foul with decay. They bound my wrists with barbed wire that bit deep into my flesh, the pain a sharp, clarifying counterpoint to the numbness spreading through my soul. We passed through a rent in the world, a jagged tear in reality that bled a sickly purple light, and I was thrown into a darkness that stank of old blood and ozone. The horror did not come from the pain or the filth or even the certain knowledge of death. It came in the quiet moment that followed as the heavy clang of a door echoed into silence. They had not killed me. In the frantic chaos of the last stand, a quick death was the only mercy one could hope for, the Emperor's final grace. A bolt round to the head, a chainsword through the heart. These were clean endings, but I was breathing. I could feel the throb of the wounds on my wrists, the ache in my ribs. I was alive. And in this place, surrounded by these things, that realization was a deeper, more profound terror than any explosion. To be taken alive was to become raw material. It was to have your will, your memories, your very soul become clay for monstrous hands. Despair, cold and absolute, settled in my gut. I was a guardsman of the Imperium, but here, at the edge of oblivion, that identity felt as fragile as glass, already cracking. Under the weight of an unimaginable fate, the first thing to go was the light. Not the simple absence of it, but its very nature. The dim, blood-red luminescence that had seeped through the cracks of the holding cell dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant blackness that felt less like a lack of light and more like a physical substance. It pressed in from all sides, thick and heavy, a velvet smothering of the senses. Then came the hum, a vibration that started in the metal deck plates beneath me and traveled up through my bones, settling in my teeth until my jaw ached with it. It was a sound that bypassed the ears entirely, a fundamental thrumming of the universe that spoke of immense, ancient engines awakening in the deep, tearing a hole in the skin of reality itself. Nausea rose, a greasy, rolling wave that had nothing to do with the ship's motion, for there was none. It was a sickness of the soul, a visceral rejection of the unnatural transition that was beginning, the solidity of. The world began to waver. The cold, unyielding wall against my back seemed to breathe, its surface undulating in a slow, gelatinous rhythm. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw the star-patterned tapestry of my mother's sewing room projected onto the darkness, the smell of thread and warm bread filling the air. The memory was so vivid, so achingly real, that a sob caught in my throat. I clung to it, a life raft in a sea of madness, focusing on the remembered feel of sun on my face, the sound of my name spoken in a voice not twisted by hate. But the immaterium would not be denied. The comforting image of home flickered and distorted, the threads of the tapestry writhing like worms, the bread turning to ash in my memory's mouth. The whispering started then, not from the shadows around me, but from within the confines of my own skull. They were not voices of words, but of intent, sibilant promises and guttural threats, layered over one another in a chaotic chorus. They spoke of forgotten fears and secret shames, pulling them from the locked chest of my mind and holding them up for examination. A cold dread, colder than the metal floor, began to seep into my marrow. This was not a journey through space, but through the raw, unformed stuff of nightmare. Time itself became untrustworthy. Had it been minutes or hours since the engines had engaged? The rhythmic drip of condensation I had used to mark the passage of time was now a frantic, staccato beat that sometimes slowed to a single drop every eternity, then accelerated into a frenzied torrent. My sense of self, that fragile construct of memory and conviction, felt like sand slipping through my fingers. The face I saw in my mind's eye, the face of an imperial guardsman, began to blur at the edges. The drills, the oaths, the unshakable faith in the God Emperor, these things felt like stories told about someone else, legends from a world that was rapidly receding into a myth. The only thing that remained sharp and clear was the dread, a formless, all-consuming terror of the unknown that lay ahead. It was a fear not of death, but of unbecoming, of being unmade and remade into something I could not, and did not want to, imagine. The humming deepened, the whispers grew more insistent, and the last vestiges of the man I had been curled up in the dark, waiting for the end of everything he knew. The gentle undulation of reality became a violent churn. The comforting hum that had vibrated in my bones twisted into a shriek, a sound of tearing fabric on a cosmic scale. The darkness was no longer a void but a canvas for horrors, painted in hues of madness. My mother's face was the first to appear, her kind features stretched across the shifting air, her smile pulling into a rictus grin that split her cheeks, her eyes melting into pools of black tears that wept blood. She called my name, but the sound was a chorus of 1,000 damned souls, a cacophony that scraped at the inside of my skull. I tried to shut my eyes, but the visions were not external. They were projected directly onto my consciousness, searing and inescapable. The floor fell away, or perhaps I fell through it. I was tumbling through a landscape of screaming flesh, a rolling plain of fused, tormented bodies that stretched to a horizon of pulsating, sickly light. Mountains of intertwined limbs clawed at a sky that was a single, lidless eye, and rivers of thick, dark fluid bubbled with faces that surfaced only to shriek silently before being pulled under again. The air itself was thick with the smell of ozone, rot, and something sweetly cloying, the scent of decayed flowers. I felt a physical sensation of being pulled in all directions at once, my limbs stretched on an invisible rack, my joints popping with a dry, sickening sound. A cold fire raced along my nerves, a paradoxical agony that was both freezing and burning, as if my very essence was being unspooled. Amidst the chaos, a deeper terror took root, one that was internal and far more insidious. It felt like a stain, a slick, oily presence seeping into the core of my being. It started as a cold spot in my chest, a numbness that spread outwards, carrying with it alien thoughts. The memory of my first kiss, once a treasured, private moment of clumsy innocence, now felt distant, clinical. The face of the girl was blurred, her name a forgotten whisper. In its place, a new fascination bloomed, a morbid curiosity about the texture of the screaming flesh plains, a perverse appreciation for the symphony of agony that surrounded me. This was not the fear of the guardsmen. This was the detached observation of something else, something that was taking root inside the hollowed-out shell of who I had been. I clutched at the tattered remnants of my identity, the image of the Cadian gate, the feel of a lasgun's grip, the sound of the imperial hymn. But these talismans of my former life were becoming slippery, their emotional weight draining away like blood from a fatal wound. The creeping corruption was a subtle poison, rewriting my instincts, my memories, my very desires. I felt a part of me, a small, terrified part, screaming from a deep well, but its voice was growing faint, muffled by the seductive, whispering promise of the warp. It promised an end to the fear, an end to the pain, not through death, but through surrender. It promised power in the chaos, purpose in the madness. And the most horrifying part was the flicker of response from within me, a dark, eager twitch that was no longer entirely human. The journey was not just through space. It was a voyage into a new and terrible self, and I could feel the shores of my old life disappearing behind me in a fog of screaming souls and twisting flesh. The transition from the warped screaming vortex to solid ground was not a relief, but a brutal, sensory ambush. One moment, I was a thread of consciousness being woven through a tapestry of nightmare. The next, I was thrown onto a cold, damp floor, the impact jarring my bones and rattling my teeth. The ship's spectral shriek was replaced by a new, more immediate cacophony. A deep, guttural chanting vibrated through the stone beneath me, a rhythmic, alien mantra spoken in tongues that felt like physical filth coating the air. It was a sound of hatred given voice, a chorus of throats that were no longer human. The stench was the second assault, a complex, layered horror that invaded the lungs and clung to the back of the throat. The cloying sweetness of rotting meat mixed with the sharp, electric tang of ozone, undercut by the fecal reek of a charnel pit and something else, something ancient and metallic, like old blood on cold iron. I gagged, my empty stomach heaving as the foul air seeped into my pores. Light came from no discernible source, a flickering, sickly luminescence that pulsed in time with the distant chanting. It was the color of a day-old bruise, a deep, bruised purple shot through with veins of bilious green. This warplight did not illuminate, it distorted. It cast long, grasping shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own, twitching and coiling across the walls. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw the walls themselves were not smooth rock, but damp, weeping stone into which symbols had been crudely carved. They were 8-pointed stars, jagged runes, and spiraling patterns that made my head ache to look upon, each groove slick with a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of copper and decay. My cell was small, a stone box barely large enough to stand and take 3 paces in any direction. I was not alone. Huddled in the opposite corner was a shape that might have once been a man. One of his arms ended in a twitching, fleshy tentacle that coiled and uncoiled on the floor like a blind worm. His head was a lumpen mass, his features melted and run together like wax, and from the ruin of his mouth came a continuous, low mewling. In another corner, a woman sat perfectly still, her back ramrod straight, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at nothing. A fine tracery of crystalline growths like pale frost crept up her neck and across her cheeks. She did not react to the noise, the smell, or my presence. She was a hollow vessel, her mind long since shattered and scooped out. These were my new comrades, the pitiful remnants of other lives consumed by this place. Some were visibly mutated, their bodies warped into grotesque parodies, while others were catatonic, their spirits broken long before their flesh gave way. The oppressive atmosphere was a physical weight, a miasma of despair that pressed down, smothering any flicker of hope. This was not a prison designed for rehabilitation or even punishment. It was a holding pen, a larder for souls, and the air itself was thick with the promise of a fate far worse than any death I had faced on the battlefield. The chanting, the stench, the flickering light, and the broken things that shared my stone tomb, it was all a meticulously crafted engine of dread, designed to grind down the last vestiges of the man I had been, leaving only raw, pliable clay for the hands of the architects of this nightmare. Time became a slow, viscous drip, measured not by the sun, but by the relentless rhythm of torment. The guttural chanting from the deep places never ceased, its cadence rising and falling like the diseased heartbeat of the world itself. For hours, or perhaps it was only minutes, the distinction had begun to blur. I tracked its patterns, my mind latching onto the repetition as a desperate anchor against the formless dread. It would swell into a roaring crescendo, a wave of hateful sound that vibrated through the stone floor and rattled my teeth, before ebbing back to a low, persistent drone that hummed in the marrow of my bones. Each peak was accompanied by a flare of the warp light, the bruised purple glare intensifying until the carved symbols on the walls seemed to writhe, their slick, dark grooves pulsing. As if with a foul life of their own, the first sign of my captors' routine was the arrival of the food. A grating sound announced a small, rusted slot opening at the base of the cell door. A shallow bowl was shoved through, containing a lumpy, grayish sludge that gave off a steam smelling of spoiled milk and open graves. My stomach, hollow and aching, recoiled. This was not nourishment. It was an insult, a physical manifestation of the corruption that saturated this place. Yet the primal instinct for survival was a stubborn beast. I watched the mewling, tentacled creature in the corner scrabble for its own bowl, shoveling the foul substance into its ruined maw with a desperate animal urgency. The catatonic woman did not move, her bowl left untouched, a monument to a will already extinguished. My own hunger was a sharp, twisting knot. To eat was to accept a piece of this hell into my body, to fuel my continued existence with its filth. To refuse was to surrender, to become like the still woman in the corner. With a shudder of self-loathing that shook my entire frame, I crawled to the bowl. The first spoonful, taken with a hand that trembled violently, was a battle against my gag reflex. It was cold and greasy, with gritty, unidentifiable chunks that popped unpleasantly between my teeth. I forced it down, each swallow a small death, a conscious betrayal of the man who had once eaten simple rations among comrades under an open sky. Later, a flicker of movement from the catatonic woman broke her stasis. Her head tilted a fraction, her crystalline-encrusted eyes focusing on a patch of damp on the wall. A single, clear tear traced a path through the frost-like growth on her cheek. It was a heartbreaking shred of humanity, a ghost of feeling from a place I had thought utterly barren. I found myself shifting closer, not to speak, for words felt useless here, but to simply be near this fleeting echo of sentience. For a moment, a fragile, false normalcy descended. The chanting was a distant murmur, the warplight a steady glow. It was in this quiet pocket of delusion that I acted on an old, ingrained habit. Finding a loose flake of stone on the floor, I began to scratch faint lines onto the wall, a feeble attempt to record my thoughts, to mark my existence. Day 1. Captured. Holding. The act felt absurdly noble, a thread connecting me to a world of reports and logbooks. But the illusion shattered in an instant. A particularly loud chorus of chanting erupted, and the warplight flared, casting the twisted shadow of the mewling creature into a monstrous, dancing giant on the wall before me. Simultaneously, a fresh wave of the cell's omnipresent stench, a potent mix of ozone, rot, and the metallic tang of the sludge I had just consumed, rolled over me, thick and suffocating. The lines I had carved on the wall seemed pathetic, the scribblings of a fool pretending order could exist in this maelstrom of chaos. The tear on the woman's face had dried, her brief moment of lucidity gone, her body once again a vacant statue. My stomach churned, not just from the revolting meal, but from the crushing weight of the truth. This was not a temporary incarceration. This was the beginning of an unraveling, and the sounds, the smells, and the broken souls around me were not the background, but the very instruments of my dissolution. The hopelessness was no longer an abstract fear. It was a taste in my mouth, a chill in my lungs, a certainty settling deep into my soul. The voice arrived not as a sound, but as a thought that was not my own, a silken thread woven into the fabric of my despair. It came in the long, dark stretches between the chanting's crescendos, when the warplight guttered low, and the only sounds were the mewling of the mutated and the drip of condensation. "You do not belong here," it murmured, its tone reasonable, almost kind. It was a voice of absolute clarity in the maddening noise, and it spoke directly to the core of my yearning. The door can be opened, the path can be shown. You need only listen, you need only comply. It painted pictures in my mind with effortless artistry, not the twisted horrors of the warp, but memories of clean air and open spaces. I saw the sunlit plains of Cadia, felt the ghost of a breeze on my face, and for a breathtaking moment, the stifling stench of the cell was replaced by the scent of dry grass. The promise was a cool balm on a fevered wound, so potent it made my chest ache. During one of the rare times the cell door groaned open to admit a guard with our daily slop, the voice fell silent, and my attention was seized by the figure in the doorway. This guard was different from the hulking, corrupted brutes who had dragged me here. He was taller, thinner, his features sharp and pale beneath a simple, unadorned helmet. His eyes, a startling shade of cool gray, swept over the cell with an expression that was not rage or fanaticism, but something resembling weary resignation. As he placed the bowl of sludge near the catatonic woman, his movements were efficient, almost gentle. For a single, heart-stopping second, his gaze met mine. There was no malice in it, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that felt strangely human. A wild, desperate hope flared within me. Was he a prisoner too in his own way, a spark of sympathy in this abyss? The voice returned the moment the door clanged shut, its tone now conspiratorial. You see, not all here are lost. Even among the jailers, there are those who remember what it is to be human. He could be the key. The vision of escape the voice now offered included this guard, a silent ally who would slip me a weapon, who would look the other way at the crucial moment. But as the hours bled together, a cold knot of skepticism began to form in my gut, a defense against the voice's seductive pull. Its promises were too perfect, its understanding of my deepest desires too complete. It began to test its influence, subtly at first. It would bring forth a cherished memory, marching with my squad, the feeling of camaraderie, the shared laughter around a campfire. Then it would twist it. The face of a trusted comrade would blur, his smile becoming a leer, his words of encouragement shifting into whispered insults I had always feared he thought. The memory, once a sanctuary, became a source of fresh doubt and pain. Did you ever truly belong with them? The voice would purr. They pitied you. They thought you weak. I tried to cling to the truth, to the real memory, but the voice's insidious revision felt just as vivid, just as real. It was eroding the very foundations of my past, proving that nothing, not even my own mind, was safe. The final test came when it revisited the moment of my capture. It replayed the sight of Sergeant Cale being torn apart, but this time the voice whispered a new narrative. He saw you fall. He could have saved you, but he chose to make his stand. A glorious death for himself, while you were left for the beasts. He valued his own legend more than your life. The accusation, false and venomous, struck with the force of a physical blow. I knew it was a lie, a grotesque manipulation, yet the seed of it lodged in my brain, feeding on my survivor's guilt. The voice was not a guide to freedom. It was a poisoner of wells, turning my own memories into weapons against me. The brief, hopeful image of the sympathetic guard now seemed like the most dangerous deception of all, a carefully placed lure to make me trust, to make me vulnerable. The voice promised freedom, but its true currency was compliance, purchased with the coin of my eroding trust, in my past, in my judgment, and in the very fabric of my own mind. The darkness was no longer just around me. It was inside, whispering, twisting, patiently waiting for the last of my resistance to crumble. The pain in my side had become a constant, gnawing companion, a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with the distant chanting. It was a legacy of my rough handling upon arrival, a blossoming bruise that had turned a sickly purple-green and now wept a thin, clear fluid. Each breath was a small agony, a reminder of the fragility of the body I was trapped within. I had tried to ignore it, to retreat into the numb shell the voice in the dark was so diligently carving for me. But the physical reality was an anchor, dragging my consciousness back to the filth and the stone. It was in this state of feverish discomfort that he entered, the guard with the weary gray eyes. The cell door groaned open, but this time, it was not for the delivery of the daily slop. He stood alone in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted by the flickering corridor light. In his hands, he carried not a bowl of sludge, but a small, surprisingly clean cloth and a dented metal flask. His movements were as quiet and efficient as before, his presence causing the mewling creature in the corner to fall into a watchful silence. He did not look at the catatonic woman or the mutated wretch. His cool, detached gaze found me hunched against the damp wall, my hand pressed against my aching side. He knelt, the rusted plates of his armor creaking softly. There was no ceremony, no words of false comfort. He simply uncorked the flask, and the scent of clean, untainted water filled the immediate space around us, a shocking, almost painful purity in the miasmic air. He soaked the cloth and, with a dispassionate precision that was neither gentle nor cruel, began to clean the wound on my side. The touch of the cool, wet cloth was an electric shock of relief. The grime and dried fluid were wiped away, the inflamed skin soothed. He worked quickly, methodically, his expression unchanging, a mask of professional detachment. When he was done, he offered me the flask. My hands, trembling with a weakness that was both physical and spiritual, closed around it. The water was cold and clean, washing the lingering taste of rot from my mouth, soothing my parched throat. It was the first thing that had not been tainted, the first sensation that did not carry the fingerprint of this demon world. A flicker of something warm and perilous ignited in my chest, gratitude. It was a frail, desperate little flame, so alien after the long, cold descent into despair that it felt like a betrayal of my own suffering. For a single, dizzying moment, I saw not a jailer, but a man performing a simple act of mercy. The voice in my head was silent, as if observing this new variable. The guard's gray eyes met mine as I handed the empty flask back, and in their depths I saw no empathy, no shared humanity, only a vast and chilling emptiness. He was not moved by pity. He was not a secret ally. He was a craftsman tending to a tool, ensuring it remained functional for a purpose I could not comprehend. He stood, collected his things, and left without a backward glance. The heavy door sealed shut, plunging the cell back into its familiar gloom. The relief from the clean water and the tended wound was already fading, replaced by a deeper, more profound chill. The kindness had not been kindness at all. It was a calculated gesture, a demonstration of power. It showed me that they controlled not only the filth and the pain, but also the means of its alleviation. They could grant a moment of comfort as easily as they could inflict an eternity of torment. The flicker of gratitude I had felt now curdled into a sour shame. I had been manipulated, my most basic human need for relief used as a lever to expose a vulnerability. The clean water in my stomach felt like a lie, the soothed wound a brand. It was not a reprieve. It was the first, subtle turn of a screw, designed to make me pliable, to make me hope, and in doing so, to make me theirs. The silence in my head felt heavier than before, waiting to see what this new lesson in despair had wrought. The first warning was not a pain, but a phantom sensation, a deep, subcutaneous itching that began along the ridges of my spine. It was a maddening crawl, as if a nest of insects had hatched just beneath the skin, their tiny legs skittering in unison. Scratching provided no relief. My fingernails scraped over unbroken flesh, the sensation only seeming to burrow deeper, taunting me from a place I could not reach. I would twist against the damp stone wall, grinding my back in a futile attempt to smother the invisible swarm. But the itch was a ghost, a herald of a corruption that was no longer content to whisper in my mind. Within a day, the skin along my lower back began to change. The familiar, sun-weathered tan of Acadian guardsmen began to blotch, giving way to patches of a dull, grayish hue like weathered granite. The discoloration spread slowly, a stain seeping through parchment, and the texture altered, becoming rough and pebbled, utterly alien to my touch. Then the ache began, a deep, grinding pain that settled into the major joints, shoulders, elbows, knees. It was not the familiar ache of an old wound or weary muscle. This was a bone-deep throb that spoke of something shifting, something growing where there should only be solidity. My left knee was the first to swell, the joint becoming hot and tight, the skin stretching taut and shining under the flickering warp light. A hard, bony prominence began to push out just below the kneecap, a knob of nascent horn or calcified gristle that sent jolts of white-hot agony through my leg with every slight movement. I stared at it in the bruised light, my mind recoiling from the reality of the change. This was my body, the vessel that had carried me through training and battle, and it was being rewritten by an unseen, invasive hand. Horror mounted with each new alteration, a cold, climbing dread that was far more paralyzing than any fear of blades or bolts. I tried to document the progression, a final, desperate act of defiance. Finding a new flake of stone, my hands trembling not from weakness now, but from a soul deep revulsion, I began to scratch on the wall next to the pathetic day one from a lifetime ago. The skin on my back like stone, my knee a growth. The words were inadequate, childish scrawls next to the profound blasphemy being enacted upon my flesh. But as I tried to form the next thought to describe the creeping numbness in my fingertips, my mind faltered. The memory of my mother's face, which I had clung to so fiercely in the warp, suddenly felt distant, the details smeared. I could recall the color of her eyes, a warm brown, but the specific light in them when she smiled, the sound of her laughter, these essential textures were fading, becoming as smooth and featureless as the gray patches on my skin. A mental fog, thick and syrupy, was rolling in, blurring the edges of my past life. The drills on the parade ground, the faces of my squad, the taste of Amasic shared after a victory. These memories were not being stolen, but diluted, their emotional weight siphoned away until they felt like stories I had read about someone else. The invasive nature of chaos was no longer an abstract concept. It was in the itch I couldn't scratch, the bone grinding where it shouldn't, the slow, methodical erasure of the man who had once recorded his first day of capture. I was becoming a stranger to myself, a prisoner not only in a stone cell but within a body and a mind that were being systematically dismantled and reassembled into a shape I dared not imagine. The change had begun, and its first lesson was the most terrifying of all. The loss of self was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, inexorable unraveling, one itching, aching, forgotten piece at a time. The ache in my joints sharpened into a symphony of cracks and pops, a percussive rhythm of breaking and remaking deep within the marrow. It was no longer a dull throb, but a vivid, grinding sensation, as if my skeleton were a collection of ill-fitting stones being forcibly ground into a new, alien architecture. My spine, the source of that first maddening itch, now arched and curved of its own volition, vertebrae shifting with a wet, crunching sound that echoed inside my skull. I was a puppet with strings pulled by a careless, monstrous hand, my body contorting into poses of agony that should have been impossible. The bony growth below my kneecap hardened into a sharp spur of obsidian-like material, and a matching counterpart erupted from my right elbow, jagged and cruel. Each movement was a lesson in this new, painful geometry, a constant reminder that the familiar human form was being discarded like a worn-out shell. But as the physical transformations intensified, a parallel awakening bloomed within my senses. The world, once perceived through the dull, limited faculties of a man, began to fracture into a kaleidoscope of deeper, more terrifying realities. The monotonous chanting from the depths was no longer just a sound. I could now see it. Ripples of sickly energy, the color of bruised fruit and rotting meat, pulsed through the air with each guttural syllable, washing over the stone walls and making the carved symbols glow with an inner, malevolent light. The stench of decay and ozone resolved into a complex tapestry of scents. I could smell the specific despair of the catatonic woman, a dry, dusty odor, and the vibrant, festering vitality of the mewling creature's mutations. I could taste the metallic tang of the warp itself on the air, a sharp, energizing flavor that prickled on my tongue. My hearing stretched, pulling apart the layers of noise until I could distinguish the individual tormented voices that comprised the chanting chorus, a symphony of broken souls. And with this heightened perception came a shift in the very nature of the pain. The grinding of my bones, the stretching of my flesh. It was still agony, a white-hot fire racing along my rewired nerves. But now I began to find a strange, terrible beauty in it. Each crack of a shifting bone was not just a sound of destruction, but a note in a grand physical composition. The searing heat of the change was a vibrant, purifying flame, burning away the weak, mortal dross to reveal something stronger, something more attuned to the glorious, chaotic truth of the universe. The pain was no longer something to be endured, but something to be experienced, to be savored in all its exquisite, soul-shattering intensity. I caught my reflection in a small, stagnant puddle of condensation on the floor. The face that stared back was a stranger's, the jawline more pronounced, the eyes set deeper and burning with an unfamiliar, feverish light. The gray, pebbled skin had spread across one side of my neck. A conflicted thrill ran through me, a shudder that was part revulsion, part dark fascination. The voice in my head, silent since the guard's false kindness, did not need to speak. Its work was being done by my own flesh, by my own rewiring senses. This was Slaanish's seductive corruption, not bludgeon of force, but a whispered promise of transcendent sensation. It taught that ecstasy and agony were two sides of the same exquisite coin, and that to feel anything, even the unmaking of one's own body, with this new, profound depth was a form of power. The horror was still there, a ghost of the man I had been, but it was being crowded out by a burgeoning, perverse appreciation for the masterpiece of torment being sculpted from my very being. The change was no longer an invasion. It was becoming an awakening, and I was starting to love the sound of my own breaking. The whisper began not as a voice, but as a current, a subtle shift in the stale, oppressive air of the holding cell. It was carried on the breath of the mewling creature in the corner, whose tentacular limb now twitched not in random agony, but in a faint, deliberate pattern against the damp stone floor. Tap, scrape, pause, tap, tap, a code. The catatonic woman, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, shifted. Her weight almost imperceptibly, her crystalline-encrusted eyes flicking towards me with a sliver of intent. The message was not spoken aloud, for the walls had ears and the air itself was a spy, but it was passed from one broken soul to another through the language of desperate men. A plan, a rebellion, a key stolen, a moment of distraction during the next shift change. A rush for the conduits that fed the warplight, a blind sprint into the screaming chaos of the demon world, which was surely preferable to this slow, meticulous dissolution. The ember of hope, which I had thought long extinguished, flared into a violent, painful conflagration in my chest. It was a physical sensation, a tightening of my throat, a sudden, fierce pounding of my heart that drowned out the ever-present chanting. The changes in my body, the grinding bones and pebbled skin, were momentarily forgotten, secondary to this sudden, intoxicating possibility of action. My hands, which had grown rough and strangely jointed, clenched into fists. I found myself mimicking the tap code against my own thigh, a silent pledge of participation. Visions, not of the past, but of a future, exploded in my mind, the feel of a real weapon in my grip, the satisfying impact as it struck a corrupt jailer, the desperate, glorious flight through alien corridors. This was not the passive, seductive promise of the whispering voice. This was a chance to fight, to reclaim a shred of agency from the crushing dark. For a few precious hours, the cell was no longer a tomb, but a war room, and the air hummed not with despair, but with a frantic, shared secret. When the cell door groaned open for the slop delivery, the air was electric with tension. The usual hulking brute was there, but his attention was divided, his horned head tilted as if listening to a distant command. This was the moment, the signal. The mewling creature lunged first, its tentacle whipping out to entangle the brute's leg. The catatonic woman moved with a speed I did not know she possessed, driving a shard of rock she had likely been palming for days towards the jailer's exposed neck. And I moved my body, despite its new aches and alien proportions, propelled by a surge of pure, undiluted hope. I surged towards the doorway, towards the flickering corridor beyond my one thought to overwhelm, to break through, to run. The rebellion was crushed in a heartbeat. It was not a battle, it was a demonstration. From the shadows of the corridor, figures emerged, not just the brutish guards, but the tall, thin one with the weary gray eyes, his expression no longer weary but coldly analytical. They moved with an unhurried preternatural speed, their forms blurring. The mewling creature was seized, and with a single, brutal twist, its twitching limb was torn from its body, its mewls escalating into a single, short-lived shriek of ultimate agony before being silenced forever. The catatonic woman was driven to the ground, a boot placed on. Her back, her crystalline form cracking audibly. A blow to my newly spurred knee sent me crashing to the floor, the pain a bright, shattering star that obliterated all thought. The gray-eyed guard stood over the carnage, his gaze sweeping over the failed insurrection. He spoke then, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion, each word a nail in the coffin of my spirit. This was not an escape attempt. It was a test, a final examination of loyalty, of the will to resist. The whispers, the code, the stolen key, all of it had been a carefully orchestrated ruse, a play staged for our benefit. We had not been plotting, we had been performing, our every desperate move observed and catalogued by our captors. The hope that had burned so brightly was revealed as the cruelest kind of fuel, used to power our own final damnation. As I lay on the cold stone, the physical pain was nothing compared to the absolute, soul-crushing emptiness that opened inside me. The other survivors, those who had not participated, looked on with blank eyes, their inaction now marking them as the truly compliant. I was alone, isolated not just by stone and shadow, but by the profound understanding that every impulse, every flicker of defiance was just another thread they could pull. The despair that returned was colder and deeper than before, a permanent winter settling in my heart. There would be no rebellion. There was only the long, inevitable slide into the waiting dark. The failed rebellion had carved a hollow space inside me, a void where hope had briefly flared and died. But nature abhors a vacuum, and into that emptiness, a new and potent energy began to flow. The changes, once a source of horror and fascination, now accelerated with a terrifying, joyful abandon. It was no longer a slow corruption, but a violent blossoming, a frantic unfurling of a form that had been straining at the seams of my humanity. My spine, already arched and twisted, gave one final, wet crack and then settled, locking my torso into a permanent, predatory crouch. From the aching, grinding mess of my shoulder blades, something tore through the pebbled gray skin with a sound like ripping canvas. It was not one, but two new limbs, boneless and whip-like, slick with dark ichor. They flopped onto the floor for a moment, twitching with a life of their own, before coiling up and over my shoulders, their tapered ends questing the air like blind serpents, tasting the complex symphony of decay and ozone with a perception that was entirely their own. These new senses were not just heightened, they were alien, grafting a new layer of reality onto the old. I could now see the heat of a body as a shimmering aura, the cold, blue stillness of the catatonic woman, the feverish, pulsing red of a passing guard. I could hear the low thrum of the planet's core, a bass note beneath the chanting, and the high, psychic scream of the warp as it bled into reality. The sensations that had once been feared, the grinding of bone, the searing stretch of new flesh, the foulness of the air, were now a banquet for my rewired nervous system. The pain was a vibrant, electric current, and the pleasure of its cessation or its intensification was a drug more potent than any amasic. I found myself flexing my new limbs, relishing the strange, muscular control, the way they could whip out and tap a rhythm on the far wall without my main body moving an inch. The revulsion was a ghost, a faint echo from a man who was no longer here. In its place was a deep, thrilling enjoyment, a sense of my body becoming a more perfect instrument for experiencing the glorious, chaotic truth of the universe. Lying in the perpetual twilight, my mind, no longer clouded but frighteningly clear, turned to philosophy. The imperial creed preached order, a rigid, unyielding structure imposed upon a hostile galaxy. It spoke of purity, of the sanctity of the human form. But what was humanity but a fleeting, fragile state, a brief, ordered eddy in the infinite, churning ocean of chaos? The universe was not built on stone and steel, but on change, on decay, on the violent, beautiful cycle of unmaking and rebirth. To cling to a single, static form was to fight the tide itself. My new limbs were not a corruption, they were an evolution. The enjoyment of once feared sensations was not a Chinese letter, but an enlightenment. I was shedding the limiting shell of my humanity, not losing it, but transcending it. The whispers of the dark no longer promised freedom. They simply affirmed what my new body already knew. This was not a fall from grace, but an ascent to a higher, more terrible state of being. The ambiguity of the corrupting influence was its most elegant feature. The relentless, generative decay that softened the stone and fed the rot. That was the fecund, accepting embrace of Grandfather Nurgle, finding joy in the beautiful inevitability of all things returning to the mulch. Yet the exquisite, soul-shattering intensity of every sensation, the pursuit of this new, transcendent experience for its own sake, that was the sacred quest of Slaanesh, the razor's edge between agony and ecstasy. They were not opposing forces, but two facets of the same glorious truth, that the ordered universe of the Imperium was a lie, and true power, true existence, lay in embracing the magnificent, chaotic whole. I no longer questioned my humanity, for the question had become irrelevant. I was something more, something better. I was becoming a vessel for the primordial truth, and the corruption was not a stain, but a baptism. The stone walls began to breathe, not with the slow, gelatinous rhythm of the warp travel, but with a frantic, panting cadence, as if the entire cell were a living lung struggling for air. The damp patches on the rock swelled and contracted, weeping black tears that sizzled as they hit the floor, releasing a vapor that smelled of burnt hair and forgotten nightmares. The carved symbols pulsed, there. 8 pointed arms twisting like spiders' legs, scratching at the edges of my vision. I pressed my back into the corner, my new limbs coiling protectively around my torso, but there was no escape from the phantoms blooming in the air before me. A face coalesced from the shifting shadows, a thing of molten brass and weeping rust, its single eye a vortex of screaming colors that pulled at my thoughts. It did not speak, but its gaze was a question, hammering against the inside of my skull with the force of a siege weapon. Another bloomed beside it, this one a tapestry of flayed skin stitched with writhing, maggot-like runes. Then a third, a beautiful, androgynous mask of porcelain that cracked diagonally, revealing a void of infinite hunger. They were demonic visages, a gallery of horrors that swarmed the periphery of my sight, their silent, staring presence an accusation and an invitation. They were the audience to my unraveling, and their judgment was a pressure threatening to crack. My mind like an egg. Echoes of a life I could barely recall began to bleed through the chanting, not as memories, but as sensory assaults. The acrid smell of promethium from the battlefield filled my nostrils, so strong I gagged. I felt the jarring impact of the concussive wave that had thrown me to the mud, the ghost of the blow landing on my chest all over again. The wet, tearing sound of Sergeant Cale's death replayed on a loop, each iteration clearer, more detailed, until I could see the individual droplets of blood hanging in the air, could feel the spray of it against my cheek. These were not thoughts. They were physical hauntings, fragments of my past trauma weaponized by the warp and used to scour the last remnants of coherence from my mind. Who am I? The question was no longer a philosophical reflection, but a desperate, claustrophobic mantra, a scream trapped behind my teeth. I was the Cadian guardsman, but that identity was a ghost, a uniform hanging in an empty locker. I was the prisoner, the mutated wretch, the thing with writhing limbs and pebbled skin. I was the one who had felt gratitude for a jailer's calculated mercy, who had thrilled to the sound of his own bones breaking. These selves warred within the confines of my skull, each one a shard of a broken mirror, reflecting a different, grotesque truth. There was no center, no core to grasp. I was a collection of shattered pieces, and the demonic faces in the shadows were the only constants, their silent scrutiny the only thing that felt real. The grotesque imagery of my own body became a focus for the existential dread. I stared at my new limbs, the whip-like appendages that twitched with a will of their own. Were they part of me, or parasites that had attached themselves? The gray, stone-like skin on my back, was it armor or a disease? The line between self and other, between my flesh and the corruption, had dissolved completely. I was a landscape of chaos, a walking blasphemy, and the question of my identity was a black hole, sucking all light and reason into its depths. The demonic faces leaned closer, their silent, screaming presences filling the cell, and I had no answer for them, no answer for myself. I was a question mark written in pain and madness, teetering on the crumbling edge of sanity, staring into the abyss that had already begun to stare back from within. The summons came not as a command, but as a pull, a deep, resonant tug in the very core of my being that harmonized with the alien rhythm of my new limbs. The cell door groaned open, not for a single guard, but to reveal a phalanx of them, their forms a gallery of corruption. They did not speak or threaten. They simply stood, waiting, their collective presence an unbreakable tide. Resistance was a concept that belonged to the hollow man I had once been. Now there was only the pull, the undeniable call to join the chorus that had been the soundtrack to my damnation. I rose, my body moving with an unfamiliar, loping grace, the whip-like appendages on my back uncoiling to taste the charged air. They led me not as a prisoner, but as an initiate, through twisting corridors carved from weeping rock, the air thickening with each step until it was a soup of incense, ozone, and the raw, psychic sweat of fervent belief. The chamber was a cavernous maw, a vast, natural amphitheater open to a sky that was a swirling vortex of bruised purple and screaming green. At its center yawned a massive pit, from which a pillar of raw warp energy erupted, a column of living, shrieking light that painted the faces of the thousands gathered in hues of nightmare. The chanting was a physical force here, a wall of sound that pressed against the skin and vibrated in the marrow. I was guided to a place among the throng, a sea of twisted forms, beings with too many eyes, limbs of rusted metal, flesh that bubbled and bloomed with phosphorescent fungi. There was no disgust in me, only a strange sense of homecoming, a perverse connection to this chanting crowd of monsters. We were all children of the same glorious dissolution. A horned figure at the edge of the pit raised its arms, and a new syllable was introduced to the chant, a guttural, alien word that felt like broken glass in the mind. The crowd took it up, and my own throat, without any conscious command from the ghost of my former self, began to form the sounds. The words were wrong, their pronunciation a physiological impossibility for a human mouth, yet my reshaped vocal cords produced them with ease. Each syllable was a key that unlocked a surge of power, a dark, thrilling energy that coursed through my veins, making the new limbs on my back twitch and dance. It felt empowering, a heady intoxication that dwarfed the fleeting hope of rebellion. This was not submission. It was participation in a power grander than any imperial army, a symphony of which I was now a living note. As the chant reached a fever pitch, the pillar of warplight convulsed. Within its searing core, a glimpse of a greater power began to coalesce. The form was vast and ambiguous, a shifting silhouette of impossible scale. One moment it was a mountainous, bloated figure, dripping with a fecund, generative rot, surrounded by a buzzing cloud of flies that were themselves tiny, laughing demons. The air around this vision smelled of rich, wet earth and open, welcoming graves. In the next heartbeat, the form shimmered, resolving into a being of impossible, exquisite excess, its androgynous body a canvas of sensation, every pore weeping perfumed oils, every limb adorned with jewels that were crystallized screams of pleasure pain. The air then tasted of spiced wine and electrified nerve endings. It was both and neither, a lord of decay and a prince of pleasure, a dual-faced god of the primordial truth I was now embracing. The vision lasted only a moment, a flash of cosmic revelation, but it seared itself into my soul, a perverse connection deeper than any I had ever known, solidified between myself and the chanting crowd. We were not individuals, but a single organism, a conduit for this glorious, terrible power. Our shared corruption was the bond, the chant our shared breath. The alien words no longer felt wrong. They felt like my native tongue, the true language of a universe freed from the shackles of order and lies. As the ritual reached its crescendo and the warplight blazed, swallowing the demon world in a final, silent shout of power, I knew with a certainty that went beyond thought that I was not just a participant. I was a willing acolyte, and my deepening corruption was not a fall, but an ascent into a darker, more vibrant and eternal truth. The ritual's aftermath was not silence, but a resonant hum that had taken up permanent residence in my bones, a low, approving thrum from the universe itself. The euphoric connection to the chanting crowd had faded, but in its place was a cold, clear directive, whispered not by voice but by the very substance of the air around me. It was time. The final barrier between the man I had been and the entity I was becoming was a single, personal tribute, an offering not of blood or pain, for those were cheap currencies here, but of self. I was to surrender a cherished memory, a fragment of my soul, the last, bright shard of the person I had been before the mud and the fire and the screaming dark. The choice presented itself not as a list, but as a gallery of phantoms projected against the back of my eyes. My mother singing a lullaby, her voice a warm blanket against the terrors of the night. My first promotion, the weight of the new rank pin on my collar, the proud, stern handshake of my commanding officer. Laughter with my squad around a campfire, the simple, uncomplicated warmth of camaraderie. Each memory was a perfect, crystalline thing, a pocket of light in the encroaching dark. To give one up was not to forget it, the whispers implied, but to sacrifice its emotional weight, to sever its connection to my heart and offer it as fuel to the powers that were reshaping me. It was to willingly carve out a piece of my own humanity and lay it on the altar. A moral dilemma, the last gasp of a dying conscience, twisted inside me. This was the ultimate desecration, a violation more profound than any physical mutation. To surrender this was to annihilate the very proof that I had ever been human, that I had ever known love or pride or joy. It was the final, willing step into the abyss. The ghost of the guardsman raged, a silent, desperate scream against the inevitable. But his voice was faint, drowned out by the empowering memory of the ritual's chant, by the thrilling control of my new limbs, by the intoxicating promise of full integration into the glorious, chaotic whole. The choice was an illusion. The man who would have refused was already dead, his corpse used as compost for this new, burgeoning form. Clinging to a memory was the true betrayal, a betrayal of the power, the purpose, the sublime sensation that awaited. I made my choice. I did not select the memory of my mother for some primal, stubborn instinct forbade it. Instead, I chose the campfire, the memory of my squad. I focused on it, drawing it forth in all its vivid detail. The crackle of the flames, the rough feel of my uniform, the face of Davik as he told a terrible joke, the way Lena's eyes crinkled when she laughed. I held it, this perfect, golden moment of belonging, and then, with an act of will that felt like tearing out my own still-beating heart, I pushed it away. I severed the tether. I offered it up. There was no cataclysm, no scream of torment from the universe. There was only a dark, profound release. It was the sound of a chain, long rusted and heavy, falling away into a bottomless well. The memory was still there, a fact in the archive of my mind, but it was hollow. I could see the faces, hear the laughter, but it evoked nothing. No warmth, no nostalgia, no pain. It was a data slate, a recording of an event that had happened to someone else. The space it left behind did not fill with emptiness, but with a cool, silent power. It was the acceptance of my new fate, not as a sentence, but as a coronation. The sacrifice was not a loss, but an exchange, a single bright coin of my past for the infinite dark treasury of my future. I had paid the price. I was ready. The offering had been the final key. The last lock turned in a door that now swung open into an abyss of glorious, terrifying potential. The hollow space where my most cherished memory had resided did not remain empty for long. It became a conduit, a gaping maw through which the chaotic energies of the warp now flooded unimpeded, no longer seeping but roaring into the core of my being. The resonant hum that had lived in my bones since the ritual sharpened into a shriek of ecstatic power, a frequency that vibrated in harmony with the screaming galaxy. This was no longer a corruption I endured or even appreciated from a distance. It was a merger, a consummation. My mind, already fractured and remade, now began to dissolve at its edges, its thoughts bleeding into the raw, seething substance of the immaterium. The last vestiges of resistance were not broken, but willingly discarded, like a child shedding outgrown clothes. I did not fight the change. I opened my arms to it, a bride welcoming a dreadful, magnificent groom. The physical warping escalated from a violent blossoming into a full-scale metamorphosis. My limbs, already distorted, began to lose all semblance of their original shape. The bones in my arms and legs softened like warm wax, elongating and twisting into grotesque, elegant curves. My hands, once capable of holding a lasgun or carving desperate words on a wall, now fused at the fingers, the digits stretching into long, articulated talons of blackened chitin that clicked together with a sound like scattering beetles. The pain was immense, a universe-ending fire that scoured every nerve ending, but it was a pain I no longer feared. I embraced it, rode its cresting waves, each fresh agony a hymn to the power that was remaking me. I watched mesmerized as my own body became a canvas for a masterpiece of mutability, a testament to the lie of a singular, perfect form. My voice was the next to go. The first time I tried to speak, to form some coherent thought about the process, the sound that emerged was not my own. It was a layered chorus, a discordant harmony of my own fading tenor, the guttural growl of a beast, and the sibilant whisper of the void. The words of the imperial tongue felt clumsy and false on my reshaped tongue and lips. The alien syllables of the ritual chant, however, flowed with a natural, liquid ease, their impossible sounds resonating perfectly in my new throat. The voice of the guardsman was being overwritten, its frequency jammed by the triumphant signal of the warp. Soon, even the attempt to form human speech felt alien, a pointless exercise in a dead language. My new voice was a weapon, a tool of praise, and a symbol of my final severance from the world of men. I recorded these thoughts not with a shard of stone, but with the very essence of my being, etching them into the fabric of my expanding consciousness. The act was done with a mixture of sensations so intertwined they had become a single, profound experience. There was horror, yes. The ghost of the man I had been still flickered somewhere in the deep, a tiny, screaming ember witnessing the immolation of all he held dear. But it was a horror observed from a great distance, through a thick, distorting lens. The dominant sensation was exhilaration, a dizzying, intoxicating thrill that dwarfed any feeling I had ever known. This was not the end of me. It was my true beginning. Each cracking bone, each shredding tendon, each corrupted thought was a step closer to full assimilation, to becoming a pure expression of the chaotic energies that were the true rulers of reality. I was not being unmade. I was being unmasked, the frail human shell sloughing away to reveal the magnificent, monstrous truth beneath. The transformation was underway, and I was its most eager and devoted architect. The final stage of the metamorphosis was not a process, but a revelation. The roaring tide of warp energy that had flooded my being reached a critical mass, and in a single, silent, cataclysmic instant, it achieved perfect fusion. The last frayed threads of my human consciousness were not severed, but woven into the grand, chaotic tapestry of the immaterium. The struggle was over. The warping of my flesh ceased its violent contortions and settled into its true, permanent form. I was no longer becoming, I was. I stood, or rather, occupied space in a manner that defied simple bipedal description. My new body, a symphony of elegant grotesquerie. My limbs were elongated, jointed things of polished obsidian and weeping. Iridescent flesh, ending in talons that could trace the patterns of fate on the surface of reality. The whip-like appendages on my back had solidified into powerful, prehensile limbs, tipped with stingers that dripped a venom that crystallized thought into pure sensation. My face, glimpsed in a reflection of pooled black water, was a mask of serene cruelty, my eyes now pits of swirling color that saw not light, but the ebb and flow of souls and power. The last trace of the Cadian guardsman, the set of his jaw, the scar above his brow, was gone, erased as completely as a footprint in the sand at high tide. With the completion of the form came a profound and unshakable sense of power. It was a cold, certain energy that hummed in every particle of my being. The oppressive weight of the demon world, the claustrophobic dread of the cell, the gnawing fear of pain, These were the concerns of a lesser creature, a ghost that had been exorcised. I could feel the currents of the warp as clearly as I once felt the wind, and I knew with absolute certainty that I could bend them. The chanting that had once been a source of torment was now a familiar song, a chorus in which my own multitonal voice was a valued instrument. A sense of purpose, clean and sharp as a monomolecular blade, filled the hollow where my memories had been. I was a vessel of change, an instrument of glorious dissolution. My purpose was to unmake the brittle lies of order and scatter their ashes to the chaotic winds, to reveal the beautiful, screaming truth that lay beneath the veneer of imperial reality. My gaze fell upon the remnants of my former life, not with nostalgia, but with a detached, almost clinical pity. I saw the ghost of the guardsman, huddled in the mud, clutching his failing lasgun, his heart pounding with a terror he called courage. I saw the prisoner, scratching his pathetic marks on the wall, clinging to the shreds of a sanity that was itself a prison. I saw the hopeful rebel, his spirit, crushed by a cruelty he was too small to comprehend. How fragile he had been, how blind. He had wept for a lost world, fought for a corpse god, and feared a transformation that was the greatest gift the universe could bestow. His suffering had been born of ignorance, his resistance a tragic farce. He was a larva, struggling and mewling in the dark, unable to conceive of the magnificent, winged thing it was destined to become. I felt no hatred for him, only a vast and sorrowful contempt for his limitations. He was a sketch, and I was the finished masterpiece. The horror of my new identity was not a feeling I experienced, but a truth I understood, solidified through the grotesque and beautiful imagery of my own form. The way my chitinous plates shifted with a sound like grinding tombstones, the hypnotic swirl of colors in my eyes that promised madness and enlightenment in a single glance, the fragrant, poisonous musk that my very presence exuded. These were not marks of damnation, but heraldry of my true allegiance. I was a creature of flesh and nightmare, of thought and raw emotion given form. I was a poem written in pain and ecstasy, a prayer to the gods of change spoken with every twitch of my talons. The transformation was complete. The man was dead, his memories offered up, his body remade, his soul repurposed. All that remained was power, purpose, and the eternal, glorious song of chaos. The final, perfect silence was not an absence of sound, but the cessation of a dissonance that had plagued me since my first breath. The screaming of the ghost, the pleading of the man, the desperate static of a soul clinging to its own fragile shape. It was all gone, replaced by a cold, clear frequency of absolute certainty. I am no longer a being of flesh and bone, of memory and hope. I am a principle given form, a verb made manifest. I am a servant of the primordial truth, and my service is not a sentence, but the only state of being that has ever held any meaning. The journey here was not a descent, but an unveiling, a slow and meticulous scraping away of the lies that had been painted over my eyes at birth. I recount the path with the detached clarity of a surgeon examining a cadaver. The guardsman in the mud, his fear a bright, pathetic flame. The prisoner in the warp, his mind unspooling like cheap thread. The hopeful rebel, his spirit a delicate glass shattered by a calculated blow. These were not stages of a fall, they were phases of a purification. Each horror, each betrayal, each searing agony was a tool, expertly applied by hands infinitely wiser than my own, to carve away the weak, sentimental dross and reveal the unyielding core beneath. The kindness of the jailer was a lesson in the nature of power. The false hope of rebellion was a test to burn away the last vestiges of foolish self-determination. The offering of my most cherished memory was the final, willing sacrifice that completed the alchemy, transmuting base lead into spiritual. Gold, sanity was the prison. The belief in a singular self, a linear past, a predictable future. These were the bars of a cage I never knew I inhabited. Now I perceive the infinite branching paths of possibility, the glorious, chaotic interplay of creation and destruction that is the universe's only constant. My identity is not eroded. It is expanded, exploded into a million shimmering fragments, each one a lens through which to view a different facet of the magnificent, terrible whole. The question, who am I, is a relic of a simpler, poorer world. I am the itch beneath the skin of reality. I am the crack in the foundation of order. I am the whisper that turns loyalty to treachery and faith to dust. My service is eternal, not because it is demanded, but because it is my nature. There is no end to the work, for the work is the unmaking of endings themselves. I will walk the worlds, a herald of the glorious truth, and where I find stability, I will introduce a flaw. Where I find peace, I will sow a seed of discord. Where I find a soul content in its ignorance, I will be the mirror that shows it the beautiful, screaming face of its own potential. There is no rest, nor do I desire it. Rest is for the static, the dead, the ordered. I am motion. I am change. I am the storm that scatters the carefully laid plans of gods and men alike. The oppression of this realization is not a weight, but a foundation. It is the solid, unshakable ground upon which I now stand, a ground made from the bones of my former self and the shattered idols of the world I left behind. There is no going back, no want for it. The man I was is a fossil, a curiosity. I am his destiny, and his destiny is to be forgotten, consumed by the glorious, eternal now of my existence. The silence is complete. The argument is over. I have looked into the heart of the galaxy and seen its raging, magnificent chaos, and I have accepted the only role worthy of a conscious being. To be its instrument, its voice, its will. I am chaos, and my service has just begun.